the screen. Okay, let's go. Let us go. Okay. Now, Rainey, you're going to be my eyes. Do you see this presentation in front of you? Because I see it.
I can see it.
Okay, is it large enough?
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Thank you for that, Rainey. Thank you. I also want to thank you for Rainey for coming up with the idea from our staff meeting. There was a lot of people that wanted to talk about the events that's currently going on from Kamloops about the children that were found, that their voices were, their spirit was so silenced for so long, but now they're able to help in our create a national consciousness in Canada. So in all life, there's a lesson. There's a purpose to everything, and I think that's one of their purposes, because it gives us a chance to reflect and saying, what are we going to do about this? Because we also had many other times when Indian residential schools have shown up in a form of compensation, the apology from Canada, and so forth. But I think there's a sense of that we're going to get somewhere more closer to a better and grander society because of these recent events. But anyway, that's my opinion. I like to observe and see where this is going. But from that, thank you again, Rainey, for suggesting this session this morning. Now I put together a PowerPoint because I've been teaching this for many years to all Canadians, and it's very important to understand that this is our history. But this history was deliberately hidden from everyone, including ourselves. Because even when I went to university for 2 terms, and that's about it, I took Introduction to Indian Studies, Native Studies, and they gave me, I still got it, they gave me that introduction, that manual. Years later, I went back to look at all the subjects that they were talking about, but you know what? It was only a 1-pager when it came to Indian residential schools. And I found that shocking, because the one thing that truly made an impact, and I teach this when I talk about how the child is protected in the middle of our community. They are the heart and soul, and how governments have tried everything they can to convert us to Christianity, to civilize us, and to be, I don't know, a non-Indian, I guess. But they did everything they could, but the one thing that they were able to succeed at, when they started taking the children away from our communities, and that destroyed us. That destroyed our culture, our strengths, but it destroyed us, and we still are not recovered. There's still a lot of work to be done. So I usually teach this in my timeline, how it was meant that the Tuo Wampum Belt, the Tuo Wampum Treaty, was how we're going to interact with each other. That we don't interfere with you, you don't interfere with us. You will have your own laws and customs. We'll have our own laws and customs. But with respect, peace, respect, and friendship, we're supposed to go down that river together. But it also shows that it didn't happen that way. It's almost like by the time the settlers have created their own government called the Dominion of Canada, then everything changed. And that's where I'm going to go with this presentation. It's a quick presentation to show you how things were supposed to be shared in terms of respecting each other, and education was going to be a key role in how we can build this country together, and we all would prosper. But it didn't happen that way, and I'll get into here's why. But I'd like to just quote here from Sweetgrass, who negotiated Treaty 6. He happened to be buried in St. Boniface graveyard right now, over there. And this is the words that he said to Alexander Morris. I am thankful that the white man and the red man can stand together. When I hold your hand and touch your heart, let us be as one. Use your utmost to help me and help my children so that they may prosper. That's the spirit and intent. That is what our ancestors was hoping for. An opportunity that their children will prosper along with others in this country. So as a result, you had treaties with the hope that everything is shared. So it wasn't ceded, surrendered, and yield. It was sharing and prospering. And along the way, we were supposed to get compensation for every land that you take up as a settler. So we would not be in this predicament that we are today if they were only to honor that treaty. So very simply, something did go wrong. From the very beginning, the settlers took over Canada, engaged in an intentional campaign of deception, which is now embedded in our Canadian official history. Generations of Canadians have grown up in that context. The right questions are no longer being asked. Jurisprudence and government policies have created a new law in history, which was the deliberate concealment of the true facts. And what is buried can be unburied. So learning and understanding the lessons is the key in moving forward. And some of you have already heard this many times, that the Queen knew her responsibilities when it became into the relationship with the Crown as allies. So she gave directives, Queen's directives, and saying, you speak on my behalf. But one thing that was listed in our treaties, Treaty 1 and 2, are these words. And further, Her Majesty agrees to maintain a school on each reserve hereby made whenever the Indians of the reserve should desire it. Free will, should you desire it. And the reserves was a place where they can build those schools. So it wasn't meant that you have to live there. But if you had children and you want them to be educated, then you take them to those places so they can learn the white man's cunning, as they say. So education and schools, the vision was that education was important for the Indigenous people from the outset of Confederation. They knew what education can do. Historically, on the Red River, there's been schools here, and St. Peter's Band and Peguis and his children were educated. His children was educated. Peter Prince was educated. Lou Riel was educated along here too, and he went to University of Montreal. So education, or how schools are to be worked, wasn't introduced at the time of treaty. They were already being seen. Now, our ancestors wanted their children to be able to participate fully in this new dominion because that's the way they were treated, as partners, as equals in the fur trade with the Hudson Bay Company and so forth. And that's how the treaties was set up since the time of 1764 with the Niagara Treaty between the British and Anishinaabe. Our ancestors saw it as a means to participate as partners in a new Canada, as co-builders of a new nation. Schools was to be constructed on home reserves set aside for each band with a school master. That's very important to understand. They asked for a school master. In the treaties, our ancestors shared their lands and territories with Canadians because they believed that this arrangement would benefit their children's and children's to come. However, the government chose a different path, the moving away of the Wapen Belt Treaty. And that's quoted as to kill the Indian and a child. I believe this is Thomas Moore from Saskatchewan. They played it up that he's a savage. They put a pistol in his hand and saying, look at this, we're going to save this young boy. When they come to our establishments, and they'll become good Indians. Now I'm going to get into these rogue of infamous characters in our history. And I could go way back because Indian residential schools started in the East, going way back to 1840s. But the ones that had a direct impact to in the West, Northwest, in the West, and our lands are the ones I'm going to talk about. In 1879, this is Nicholas Flood Davin, who produced a report on Indigenous schools for Indians and half-breeds, otherwise known as the Davin Report, in which he advises John A. Macdonald, the federal government, to institute residential schools for Indigenous youth. And recommendations to decimated Canadian Indigenous families. Davin says residential schools is the most effective means of civilizing the Indian population. He says to target children because adults could not be freed from their present state of ignorance, superstition, and helplessness. It's easier to mold the mind of a child. That's what they were thinking. And another one is Bishop Vittel Grandin. When he found out that because of these treaty obligations that they're debating on building schools on reserves, now he was the Bishop of the West, and he intervened by sending out letters. But in those letters, he says, we'll instill in them a pronounced distaste for native life so that they will be humiliated and reminded of their origin. When they graduated from our institutions, the children have lost everything native except their blood. Kill the Indian in the boy or something like that. Grandin was very early supporter of the Canadian Indian residential school system, believing that the best way to civilize Indigenous peoples was to educate the young. In 1880, he wrote a letter to Public Works Minister who's going to put this all together, the grand plan. He's the architect, is Hector Louis Langevin, explaining that the boarding schools was the best way to ensure children will forget the customs, habits, and language of their ancestors. At that time, who was responsible for the Indians was Edgar Dewdney. He also combined as a position as an Indian commissioner, in which he held an office of 1879 to 1888, and with the lieutenant governorship beginning in 1881. So he was very much involved to set this up. And Dewdney was a central figure in some of the most dramatic events in the department's history, how the department will be set up under the Indian Act. And with his relationship with the Indians and a strategic use of rations leading up to the rebellion in 1885 and forcing the Plains nations into starvation so they can sign treaty. Like those of his peers, Dewdney's actions were heavy-handed and often cruel. But in him, his superiors found little fault in that. In fact, Dewdney would maintain a close relationship with John A. Macdonald, and after the end of hostilities, continued on to implement the Oppression Indian Act policies and laws that limit Natives' freedoms and expanded the residential school system. So the goal of Indian residential schools was a plan to kill the Indian child, to establish a system of Indian residential schools. And it all began in 1883, when Prime Minister then John A. Macdonald passed into cabinet measures into law to create residential schools in the West to be operated by the Catholic and Anglican churches. The plan was announced in the House of Commons by Public Works Minister Hector Langevin, who said these words: "In order to educate the children properly, we must separate them from their families. Some may say that this is hard, but if we want to civilize them, we must do that." And in the House of Commons, John A. Macdonald says, "When the school is on a reserve, the child with his parents who are savages. He is surrounded by savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training and mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from their parental influence. And the only way to do that would be to put them in central training industrial schools where they acquired the habits and mode of thoughts of white men," in 1883. So it was the government's belief that Indigenous peoples were uncivilized and were socially and culturally, intellectually inferior. And that was that era. That was the Victorian age, where the British superpower is the ultimate form of civilization. It was also the time of Darwinism, that theory that, might is right, or the stronger species will overcome the weaker species. So this was going on, but it went way long time ago, the time of Christopher Columbus, when they actually labeled that the new people in a new world were savages, were animal-like. They're not even human. So this ingrained in many, many minds of the rest of the world, in Europe, and now the Canadians. They needed to be civilized through education and Christianization. So that was the goal. So it started becoming legal and force under the Indian Act of 1876, because they had a fiducial responsibility, actually, to educate Native children. It was a treaty right obligation, but they're going to do it their own way. So Indigenous fear, making Native people unable to adopt to a modern Canadian society. They said they're going to be overrun. They're going to have to be looked after like animals in a zoo, where they are now the endangered species, and we have to protect them. So under the Indian Act, we all became wards of Canada. As long as the Indian Act is still around, we're still wards of Canada. So it was all about converting natives to Christianity, save their souls. This way they'll able to save themselves. Now, who's going to run these schools? It's going to be religious groups. It'll be the Catholic, Anglican, United, Presbyterian churches. They were all involved, and many other churches other faiths were involved as well. This was the means to force assimilation of white societal cultures, their values, their religion, and their languages. And it was children that were easier to mold their minds or brainwashed than adults. Children must be removed from family and their cultural influence as far away as much as possible. That reminds me of my mentor. She's struggling right now, Margaret LaValle and Jules LaValle, and Jules is in a hospital at the moment. Margaret, I worked with her many times, but she always told her stories growing up in Saugeen, Fort Francis residential schools. She's from that community, but she always talked about that she can look out the window and just see down the road her house and her family, but she could never leave beyond the fence line. And she felt so alone and abandoned as a little child, even though she can see her family through a window. Anyway, I'm thinking about her last few days. Now, they guesstimated that for success of their endeavor, of their plan, it'll go on for 2 generations and then it'll be complete. I don't know what that would look like in terms of what were you supposed to be, no longer Indian, but then what? Because we don't have culture, we don't have anything. I don't know what the plan was, the end goal. But it went on for more than that. It went on for 5 generations. So why did they go? Because this is the law. This is Canada's law. This is the law of Canada. And it started with 1857, the grandfather of the Indian Act, is the Gradual Assimilation Act, which was focusing on assimilating Indians. So the bane of our existence is the Indian Act and Indian Affairs that still currently goes on today. But in there, they made laws that it was compulsory attendance, that all Native children from the age of 5 to the age of 16 must attend these schools. 75% of the population did go to these schools, and that's roughly about 150,000 children, many generations. Children were forcibly taken on from their homes by priests, Indian agents, and police officers, and went on. They were put in cars, trucks, automobiles of all kinds, buses, trains, airplanes, and they were taken to faraway places. Indian agents on reserves would withhold food or benefit for those that resisted and was threatened with imprisonment. That's one of the reasons why they created the penitentiary here in Manitoba. Because if you resist as a father, then you're going to get typically it was 4 to 6 months hard labor working in the quarries. So by then you're defenseless, you're powerless, and they forcibly took them from you. So life at Indian residential schools, it was a boarding school system. They borrowed that from England and Europe, that essentially to address poverty, children were forced into these boarding schools. And you might see it in the old Charles Dickens movies and novels, but that was the model. And it wasn't your typical day school where you're going to focus is on education. So often the children were away from their homes. On average, from the stories that I heard, stayed away from their communities for 10 years. Now, if you're lucky, you would be able to go home for the summer. But the Indian residential schools that I went to, Mackay residents, and there was a lot of them that came from places like Nelson House and Cross Lake and Pakatawagan, St. Teresa Point. Now, if their communities were able to go and get them for holidays, they went. But sometimes small communities don't have that kind of budget. So they had to stay year round from September. Oh, they did everything they can to go from Christmas till June, and they closed that up for the summertime. Children had their names changed, or worse, they were simply given a number. The school system was dramatically underfunded. They had to have children as forced labor to plant food in the gardens, to create some revenue. And now the staff it's well-known staff would always get the best food. Well, the children always get leftovers and re-leftovers and so forth. But the children always, all the stories that I heard many times of how they're constantly hungry all the time. And they can't eat that kind of food that they're giving. So usually most of the schools was run by the church. The teachers would be nuns or priests, and teachers were understaffed and unqualified. Natives were taught that their culture, their appearance, their clothing, their spiritual beliefs, their languages were inferior and wrong, and go as far as calling it evil, and introducing shame to be an Indian. Children were not allowed to speak their language, and were often if you were caught doing so, you'll often be beaten. But imagine this: if you only know Anishinaabe or you only know Cree, and then you're just a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old, and you know, because they pick them up that just as early. And you'll be punished from day one. They say, stop that heathen language, and be punished from day one. And that's all they know is their original language. So I always do a broad question. Was it really truly about education, or was it child labor? And it's a bit of both, because education only went so far. After chores, you get some classroom time, only in the morning. Oh yeah, you have to go to chapel first. You have to go and pray first, and then you go to the classroom. But in the afternoon was focused on supporting the schools. So you're working in the fields, girls are working inside the school, and so forth. So as other Canadians were getting their education, higher grades, the most common grades, and this is my grandfather, he told me when I asked him, what's the highest grade you ever got? He said grade 4, I think. He says he wasn't sure. But that was common. It was a grade 4 or even a 6 level. But what is constantly there was this abuse. Some schools had dedicated and caring staff. I had heard the stories of that, but also had stories where the mother says, I didn't get that kind of abuse. You know, I wasn't affected. And meanwhile, she's sitting with her children, her daughters, and said, Mother, you were affected because you turned whatever you learned there on us. So that would hit home. But anyway, there were some kind people, but it was the way it was set up. But in many other school, teachers use their position to abuse the students emotionally, physically, and sexually. And children were in a helpless situation. So they've been traumatized. They would fall, they would go deep inside, and when they look at it, it's a nightmare, it's a dream, it's to be forgotten. So, but the impact, when the children were taken from their homes, the community was left in a state of shock. Just think about the community that didn't have no children. There will be babies, but the babies eventually have to go sent out when they become children. So communities without children it's unimaginable, actually. Native children were deprived of normal family life and did not learn how to be parents. So there was no transference of parenting skills or all these beautiful teachings about empowerment, survival skills, how to be a strong human being, but that not to be nurtured as a child, not to be hugged, not to be appreciated. You know, psychiatrists and experts, health experts agree that you will get disabled if you don't receive that kind of affection. And it's a sad experiment, but they did an experiment on this when one baby was held and loved and fed and, you know, given everything, and the other baby was ignored. That baby died. That's what will happen if you don't physically die, you die inside. There was a lot of reports of death by loneliness. Well, anyway, Native children were deprived of a normal family life and did not learn how to be parents. Children were taken from their homes, culture, land, and communities. Their identity was torn from them. Many children who went to Indian residential schools never came home because they died from disease, beating, suicide, failed escapes, in some cases, manslaughter. About 5,000 children died in the schools, according to what is currently available from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But the real numbers are higher than that because records get destroyed or they get damaged through fire or flood and water damage and such. But the stories that are spoken from the hearts of those children or the direct witnesses says they seen those deaths, they seen those atrocities. So that number is so low. But there was a ray of hope in this form of this man named Dr. Peter Bryce. He's a former medical inspector for the Department of Indian Affairs in Ottawa. He was the first one and was fired because he had concerns of what he saw in residential schools. He went and investigated why is there so much death being reported in from Alberta and British Columbia. So he personally went and to figure it out. He came back with his report and he gave it to his superiors, to the government. And he wrote in there, I believe the conditions is being deliberately created in our Indian residential school to spread the infectious disease. The mortality rate among students often exceed 50%. This is a national crime. So in his report to the Department of Indian Affairs, Superintendent Duncan Campbell Scott in May of 1909 fired Dr. Price. But he couldn't let it go. He had to let Canadians know what was going on. So he published a book in 1922, The Story of a National Crime, an appeal for justice to the Indians of Canada, the wards of the nation, our allies in the Revolutionary Wars, our brothers in arms in Great War. He was trying to get the attention of Canadians that this has to stop. This atrocity must be over. But this is 1922. The laws back then was complete. You could not leave the reserve. You needed an Indian pass. So it became out of sight, out of mind policy for Canada. So people grew up without even seeing Indians. There was a point when people are surprised that there's Indians in Canada, especially for new immigrants. They said, I didn't know there was Indians left in Canada. But that's the complete of the lie. That's the complete of the deception. Just to let you know that as part of the Worst Canadian poll, a panel of experts commissioned in Canada's National History of Society have named Scott as one of the worst Canadians in August of 2007. But he's not the one that he is just part of the system. In April 10, and we got all this research for the thanks from the Truth and Reconciliations Commission and how researchers are out there all the time, you know, getting these letters and memos and so forth. You know, in 1910, he was referred to how he envisioned the Indian problem. That was the time he fired Dr. Bryce. And Duncan Campbell Scott was describing a planned murder when he came up with the expression. Since he first used it in response to the concern raised by the West Coast Indian agent about the high level of deaths in the coastal Indian residential schools, Kamloops. In April 12 of 1910, he wrote, "It is readily acknowledged that the Indian children lose their national resistance to illness by inhabiting so closely to the schools, that they die at a much higher rate than in their villages. But this alone does not justify a change to the policy of this department, which is geared towards the final solution of our Indian problem." So he was responsible to do more in eliminating Indigenous culture, identity, and so forth. But his main goal was he was called the No Indians Left policy. And he came up with the term final solution. It wasn't a Nazis, that was Canadians. And this Indian Act policies went around the world, was copied. Just think about South Africa during the time of apartheid. So in summary, at its height, there was 137 Indian residential schools. In the 1960s, Indian Affairs started to phase out Indian residential schools. They were starting to introduce children that are on reserves that are nearby a town can go to those schools. So they started doing that. And they realized, health experts says this is not even making any kind of impact, but the opposite. So in 1979, the Indian Affairs announced that the federal government will gradually hand over control of Indian education to Indian organizations. And that's part of the pressures of Wabang, our tomorrows, when it comes to our education policies for our own children and non-interference. So Indian Affairs decided to close all the Indian residential schools and transfer this responsibility to Indian Band Control. There are over 500 plus First Nations in Canada, 638 actually, that are seeking their own schools, which was promised in treaties. But there was hardly any schools in those, on reserves. There may be occasional, already some day schools are happening. So by the time 1979 came along, there are 12 Indian residential schools left with 2,000 students, and that's where I come in. I'm the 3 generations that went to Indian residential schools. I went to Mackay Residence in Dauphin. And that one closed its doors in 1987. It just so happens that they're doing an Indian residential school gathering in August, early week of August this year, this summer. But it takes a long time to build these schools. And when you close down one, when you build a school on your communities, you can close down schools, those Indian residential schools. So that's why in 1996, the last one was closed down, and that was Gordon School in Saskatchewan. And that was in full operation for 100 years. So just imagine the generations that went through that one school alone. But the important thing to understand, it wasn't just those that went to schools. It was the descendants. It was the children's that were impacted by those that went to schools. I often say, if you can imagine a hornet nest in a tree, of the one I went to school, then you think about how many other hornets' nests are the ones that went to that school in that tree. But all the bees that came from that hornet nest affects the whole area. That's how much long reaching that Indian residential school impact had. So these harmful effects of residential schools era lasted for way over 150 years. And it continues to devastate the lives of Indigenous people today. And health experts all agree it's post-traumatic stress syndrome. It's trauma. It's connection with family and community, loss and confusion about spirituality, difficulty with relationships, difficulty expressing emotions, fear or lack of respect for authority figures, flashbacks, being triggered, associated traumas, certain smells, foods, sounds, noise can trigger flashbacks, memories, and anxiety attacks. Extreme depression as well. So all this has an impact, and there are so much of intergenerational effects that this impact is shown in symptoms of alcohol and drug abuse, low self-esteem, sexual abuse, eating disorders, and it leads to what we see in our streets. People that have been institutionalized through either in residential schools or after they came out of residential schools are impacted by Child's Aid Society and 60 Scoop, and then you get into CFS and child welfare agencies. And so when does the cycle stop? That's the question. We need to do healing. We need to come to terms of this, that we need to have control over our own fate, to look after ourselves and not have governments. You had your chance and you blew it big time. So when it came to health profiles of today, Canadians, Aboriginal people die earlier than their fellow Canadians on average, sustain a disproportionately share of their burden of physical disease and mental illness. This burden is associated with unfavorable economic and social conditions that are explicitly linked to Native people's history of oppression. It's linked to history, but it's linked as living human beings to that history. And I was involved with statistics ever since I was in the health field back in the early 90s. So we were statistics all galore all the time. So there's always being updated. And then somebody will have a fancy solution here, fancy solution there. But the thing is, it's top outsiders telling us what we need to do. But anyway, this is a scorecard. This shows exactly what's going on. This so-called Indian problem is not our creation. It's a Canadian problem. And they created the jails. They created our overrepresentation in the justice system, our child welfare, and so forth, and poverty and violence and such, justice. But you know what? That's over now. It's time that we control our own fate. We look after our own people. So it's about recovery. It's about healing. Being able to understand the impacts and effects reduces the stress level of an individual struggling to come in terms what is happening in their homes, in their family systems, their communities. Reaching out to caring and understanding people in our communities. Secondly, to find a safe environment to disclose of what is happening and to take the right steps to the recovery phase. That it's all about the healing now. So in order for us to create our own governing structures and our own governing systems, our nationhood, we need to create a healthy nation. We need to go and do the healing process. We need to establish our wellness centers. We need to incorporate in every plans that we do, we're incorporating a healing aspect to it, a well-being to it. And that's kind of the work that we're putting together. I believe Donna is actually doing a list and of all the Indian residential schools in our territory. There are over 80,000 former students of these schools that are still alive, but the thing is the number is going down really quick because a lot of times we don't get to live a longer age. So we have so much illnesses and disease that we die at a younger death, a younger age. But the survivors are now opening up and talking about their experience. They've been doing so. I remember when it started in the 1990s, very slow. But eventually it helped because it brought the attention of what was going on in our communities, in our families. Of course, this led on June 11 in 2008, where Prime Minister Stephen Harper made a formal statement of apology to former students of Indian residential schools, and he basically he took that speech and he went into his office and he added a few more. We are sorry to it. And I think when he talked, there was a moment of where I think he was overwhelmed with the situation that I believe that for that moment he was sorry on behalf of Canada. But actions speak louder than words. I am, for one, don't believe from that apology there was tremendous change. In fact, it was just the opposite. So I'll let everybody decide what they think about it. But for me, it was just that, and everybody had apologized to you. You're always going to figure out, are you sincere? Are you sincere that you apologize, like you're sorry? And the action piece must be present. Your behavior must be present. You must demonstrate change. And that didn't happen. It might have happened with reconciliation, but that was just another form of getting us involved in our own misery. Well, anyway, this is my presentation. It'll be available for those that want to share this. Will be saved and we'll give you a password and you can share it with others. No, I just wanted to start off with the sharing circle and open it up for all of us. I'm just gonna stop recording. I'm gonna stop recording right now. Okay. Stop.